The call came at 2:47 in the morning, and Nurse Reyna Caldwell almost didn't answer it. She was already in her car, still wearing her scrubs, hands wrapped around a gas station coffee that had gone cold somewhere between the ICU and the parking garage. 12 hours. She had just worked 12 hours straight, a septic patient in bed 4, a post-op complication in bed 9, a code at 1 a.m. that they'd pulled back from the edge by the skin of their teeth. Her left knee ached the way it always did after a long shift. The old injury from Kandahar that never fully healed never let her forget. She saw the name on the screen, Dispatch, Mercy Regional. She almost let it go to voicemail, she answered. Caldwell, they need you back for a consult. Toxicology report on your patient in 4 is flagging something. She closed her eyes. I'll be there in 10. She set the coffee in the cup holder and pulled out of the lot onto Route 9, the road empty and black and wide as a river. The town of Harwick, New Hampshire was quiet at this hour. A few gas stations, a 24-hour diner with orange light bleeding through the window glass, the kind of quiet that felt like the whole world had gone to sleep and left you alone in it. She almost didn't see the lights behind her. The cruiser's blue and red filled her rearview mirror before she even registered that she had done anything wrong. She hadn't. She had been doing exactly the speed limit. She had stopped fully at the light on Concord Street. She had both hands on the wheel, and her seatbelt across her chest and her hospital ID still clipped to her scrubs. She pulled over anyway, because that was what you did. The officer took his time getting out of the car. She watched him in the side mirror, tall, heavyset, the particular walk of someone who knew he had all the time in the world and wanted you to know it too. The nameplate on his uniform read Driscoll. License registration, he said, before he'd even made it fully to her window. Of course. She reached for her glove compartment slowly, deliberately. She had learned to move slowly around certain kinds of people. Can I ask what I was pulled over for? You crossed the center line back there on Miller. She hadn't. She knew she hadn't because she had been thinking about exactly that, keeping the car straight, staying in her lane the way she always did when she was exhausted. But she said, I apologize. It's been a long shift. You been drinking tonight? No. I'm on my way back to the hospital. I'm an ICU nurse. He looked at her ID badge. He looked at her scrubs. He looked back at her face with an expression she couldn't quite name, not skepticism exactly, more like decision, like he had already made up his mind about something. Step out of the vehicle. She blinked. I'm sorry? Step out of the vehicle. Ma'am, officer, I have a knee injury, a service-connected disability. Getting in and out of the car is... I won't ask again. She got out of the car. The moment she put weight on the leg, it buckled slightly, the way it always did in cold weather, in the early morning, after a long shift with no time to stretch or rest. She caught herself on the doorframe. Driscoll watched her do it. Trouble standing? I told you. I have a disability. Walk to the back of the vehicle. She walked. It was slow, and she knew it was slow, and she could feel his eyes on every step. When she reached the back bumper, he told her to put her hands on the trunk. Am I being detained? She asked. I'm conducting a sobriety check. On what grounds? You crossed the center line, and you're having trouble walking. The metal was cold, and she was cold, and somewhere in the middle distance, a truck passed on the highway with its lights cutting through the dark. She thought about her patient in bed 4. She thought about the toxicology consult waiting for her. She thought about 12 hours of work, and a cold coffee, and an old wound that never let her forget where she had been. Driscoll conducted his field sobriety test. She performed every task he gave her, walk the line, touch her nose, follow his pen light, and she performed them correctly because she was sober, because she was a nurse who understood neurological function, because she had spent 5 years in the Army learning to think clearly when everything else told her to panic. He still put her in handcuffs. I'm placing you under arrest for driving under the influence and resisting a lawful order. I did not resist. I did everything you asked. You were slow to comply. She didn't argue further. She had learned that too. At the Harwick police station, she was processed by a desk sergeant who barely looked at her. She asked to call the hospital. She was told she could make her call after booking. She asked about her rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The desk sergeant looked at her for the first time. You can take that up with your lawyer, he said. She was put in a holding room. Not a cell, technically, but a room with a door that locked from the outside and a camera mounted in the corner. She sat on a plastic chair, and she pressed her hands flat on the table, and she breathed the way she'd learned to breathe in the middle of things that felt like they were going to break her. In through the nose, out through the mouth, count to 4. She had been here before, not in this room, but in this feeling. Afghanistan, 2019, a forward operating base 20 miles from anything resembling safety, a situation she had not caused and could not control and had to survive anyway. She had done it then. She would do it now. Her phone was in her car. She had not been allowed to take it. When they finally let her make a call, she used the landline to dial the only number she had memorized, her sister Priya's cell. Priya answered on the second ring, groggy and then immediately sharp, the way she always shifted when she understood something was wrong. "I'm at the Harwick police station," Reyna said. "I need you to call Captain Hollis at the base. Tell him what happened, and call the hospital and tell them I won't be making that consult." "Reyna? What?" "I'll explain everything. Just call Hollis." She hung up. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, sitting in that locked room in the early morning, was what was already in motion. Captain Jerome Hollis had been awake since 0200. He was a careful man, a methodical man, 22 years in Army logistics, and now 3 years running the Veteran Services Office at the Harwick VA. He had known Reyna Caldwell for 2 of those 3 years, since she'd come through his office after discharge, since she'd filled out her disability paperwork and he'd reviewed her service record, and he'd thought, this woman is going to be just fine. He had not expected to get a phone call about her at 3 a.m. He made 4 calls in the next 30 minutes, 1 to the duty officer at the VA, 1 to his contact at the New Hampshire State Police, 1 to a woman named Colonel Adaze Morrow, who ran the Army Criminal Investigation Division field office in Manchester, and who owed him a favor from a thing he didn't talk about, and 1 to a lawyer named Garrett Sullivan, who specialized in veteran civil rights and who had, in Hollis's experience, a particular talent for making police departments very uncomfortable very quickly. By the time the sun came up, Reyna was still sitting in that room. Her knee hurt. She had not slept. She had been given a cup of water, and nothing else. She was beginning to understand that this was not going to resolve itself quietly. Officer Driscoll came back at 6 a.m. with a form to sign, an acknowledgement of the charges, driving under the influence, failure to comply. He set it on the table in front of her with a pen and said nothing. She looked at the form. She looked at him. "I won't sign this," she said. "It's standard procedure. I was not under the influence. I did not fail to comply. What I did was walk slowly because I have a documented disability that affects my left knee, and I told you that before you put me in handcuffs. You failed the field sobriety test. I passed every task you gave me. In my assessment, your assessment is not a blood alcohol test," she said. "Where's my back result?" Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not quite. Something more like the awareness that a thing he had assumed would be easy was becoming complicated. "The test is being processed. When it comes back at 0, she said, I would like to know what happens next." He left without answering. The result came back 2 hours later. Blood alcohol content, 0.0. They had taken a blood draw at the station without telling her what they were testing for, and she had let them because she had nothing to hide and because she understood that the documentation would matter later. She was released at 9:14 a.m. with no explanation and no apology. Her car had been impounded. She was given a form with a number to call about retrieving it. She was told she could go. She stood on the steps of the Harwick police station in her scrubs in the cold October morning, with her hospital ID still clipped to her chest, and for a moment she just stood there. Then Priya pulled up to the curb. Priya, who had driven 40 minutes from Concord, who had their mother in the passenger seat and a thermos of tea and the particular expression she got when she was trying very hard not to cry. "I'm okay," Reyna said. "You don't look okay. I will be." She wasn't, entirely, but that was separate. What she did next was what she had always done when a situation exceeded what she could manage alone. She documented everything. She wrote down every word Driscoll had said, every instruction she had followed, every task from the field sobriety test and how she had performed it. She wrote down the time of the stop, the temperature, the road conditions. She wrote down what the desk sergeant said and when they let her call. She wrote it all down because she had learned in the Army that the thing that saves you is usually not the moment itself, but the record you kept of the moment. Then Garrett Sullivan called her. He was a compact, quiet man in his 60s, with a voice like gravel and a habit of pausing before he said anything important, as though he was weighing each word for freight. He had reviewed what Hollis had sent him. He had already submitted a public records request for the dashcam and bodycam footage from the stop. He had contacted the New Hampshire State Medical Licensing Board to confirm that her service-connected disability was documented and on record. "Here's what I think happened," he said. "I think Officer Driscoll saw a woman driving alone at 2:47 in the morning and made a decision before he ran your plates. I think when he noticed the disability hang tag and the hospital ID, he was already committed to a story, and he didn't know how to walk it back. I think he filed those charges expecting you to either pay the fine or disappear." "He was wrong," Reyna said. "He was very wrong," Sullivan said. The dashcam footage arrived 3 days later in response to the records request. Sullivan called her the morning he received it. "I want you to watch this," he said. "Not because it's easy to watch, because you need to see what it shows." She watched it that evening on her laptop at the kitchen table in her apartment. The footage was in 2 parts, the exterior dashcam from Driscoll's cruiser and the bodycam from his chest. The dashcam showed her car on Route 9, traveling at exactly the speed limit in the center of the lane. It did not show her crossing the center line. It showed her pulling over immediately and completely when the lights came on. The bodycam showed the stop. It showed her asking why she had been pulled over. It showed her producing her license and registration without hesitation. It showed her explaining her disability. It showed Driscoll ordering her out of the vehicle without giving her time to accommodate her knee. It showed her walking to the back of the car slowly, carefully, with the particular gait of someone managing chronic pain. And it showed Driscoll watching her with an expression that had nothing to do with concern and everything to do with certainty. The certainty of a man who had already decided. It showed her performing the sobriety test correctly, walking the line, touching her nose, following the light. It showed him placing her in handcuffs anyway. She watched it twice. She didn't cry. She had been in situations that were worse, physically, viscerally worse, and she had not cried in those either. But there was something about watching herself, about seeing the thing from the outside, the reality of it, the undeniable record of what had happened, that settled something cold and solid in her chest. "What do we do with this?" she asked Sullivan. "We file a complaint with the department," he said. "We file a civil rights claim under the ADA and Title 42. We request an independent investigation. And I'm going to send a copy to Colonel Morrow at CID, because you are a veteran, and what happened to you on that road constitutes a protected class violation under federal law." She was quiet for a moment. "He's going to say I was impaired, that the footage doesn't capture everything, that it was his judgment call. He will say exactly that," Sullivan agreed. "And then I will show a judge and jury the dashcam footage, the blood draw at 0, your service record, your disability documentation, your performance evaluations at Mercy Regional, and the testimony of Captain Hollis, who has known you for 2 years and is prepared to say exactly what kind of person you are. And then I'll let them decide." The complaint was filed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the story had reached the Harwich Gazette. By Friday, it had been picked up by the Manchester Union Leader. By the following Monday, it was on the Associated Press wire. Reyna hadn't expected that part. She had expected a process, slow, institutional, the grinding gears of official response. She had not expected the phone calls from other nurses, from other veterans, from women, mostly, who had their own stories about being stopped on empty roads at night and not believed. From people who had never served, but who understood something in their bones about what it meant to do everything right and have it used against you anyway. She didn't speak to the press, not at first. Sullivan advised her to stay quiet while the investigation was pending, and she agreed, because she had learned to trust the process even when the process was frustrating and slow. The Harwich Police Department issued a statement saying that Officer Driscoll had acted within departmental guidelines and that the matter was under internal review. The statement did not mention the dashcam footage. It did not mention the blood draw. It did not mention the field sobriety test that she had passed. Sullivan sent the footage to the AP. The internal review, Reyna later learned, had already been quietly concluded before the department issued that statement. Driscoll had been found to have acted appropriately. No disciplinary action was recommended. The memo was dated the same day the Gazette story ran. Colonel Morrow's office received a copy of that memo. What happened next was not quick, and it was not clean, and anyone who tells you that justice is swift has probably never had to wait for it, but it was real. The CID investigation took 11 weeks. Reyna was interviewed 3 times, once at Sullivan's office, once at the VA, once in a formal session at the Manchester field office with a recorder on the table and Morrow herself asking the questions. She answered everything. She was not afraid of answering everything. She had nothing to hide, and she had learned, in the Army and in the ICU both, that the truth did not require management, only patience. Driscoll hired a union attorney. The department hired an outside communications firm. There were 2 press conferences where department representatives talked about the complexity of roadside assessments and the difficulty of making judgment calls in real time, and Reyna watched them from her living room and felt the cold, solid thing in her chest get colder and solider with each word. But the footage didn't change. The blood draw didn't change. The dashcam still showed her car in the center of the lane. The body cam still showed her passing every test. Facts had a way of being stubborn like that. The federal civil rights complaint was reviewed by the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Sullivan had filed it under 42 U.S.C. 1983, deprivation of rights under color of law, and under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA claim was particularly strong, he explained, because Driscoll had been informed of her disability before he ordered her out of the vehicle and before he used her gait as evidence of impairment. He turned her disability against her, Sullivan told the investigator. He was told she had a service-connected injury. He watched her walk with that injury and wrote it down as suspicious behavior. That's not a judgment call. That's discrimination. The trial was scheduled for March. By the time it arrived, Reyna had returned to work at Mercy Regional. She had never actually been suspended. The charges had been dropped in October when the blood draw results were formalized, and her supervisor had called her personally to say that her position was secure and that she was welcome back whenever she was ready. She had taken 2 weeks. She had needed them. She testified on the 3rd day of the trial. Sullivan had prepared her for what the defense attorney would do, which was attempt to establish that Driscoll had acted in good faith, that the center line crossing was real, that her gait had been legitimately concerning, that the arrest was a reasonable response to a reasonable concern. The defense attorney was competent and measured, and she sat across from him on the stand and answered every question he asked her with the same calm she had used in the back of that cruiser, in the holding room, in 11 weeks of waiting. Miss Caldwell, isn't it possible that you did cross the center line and simply don't remember doing so? No. Isn't it possible that your fatigue after a 12-hour shift could affect your driving? Fatigue can affect driving. My blood alcohol content was 0. The dashcam shows my car in the center of the lane. Those are the facts. You were walking with difficulty when you exited the vehicle. I walk with difficulty because I have a service-connected injury to my left knee, which I informed Officer Driscoll of before he asked me to exit the vehicle. He used my disability as evidence of impairment after I had explained to him that it was a disability. The defense attorney paused. He looked at his notes. He moved on. Sullivan's closing argument was 22 minutes long. He showed the jury the dashcam footage twice. He put Driscoll's body cam on the screen and paused it at the moment, the exact moment, when Reyna had finished the heel-to-toe walk, turned around, looked at Driscoll, and Driscoll had reached for his handcuffs. She passed every test, Sullivan said. She answered every question. She told him about her injury. She gave him her license and registration without hesitation. She walked the line, and he put her in handcuffs anyway, not because she failed, because he had already decided she would. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. The verdict was in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. Driscoll was terminated from the Harwich Police Department the following week. The department, under the settlement agreement, was required to implement mandatory disability awareness training for all officers and to install a new oversight process for nighttime stops. The town paid a settlement that Reyna did not publicly disclose, at her own request, because she had not done this for the money, and she did not want people to think that she had. Captain Hollis called her the morning after the verdict. He didn't say much. He said he was proud of her, and he said the VA had been following the case and that her courage had already started conversations at the administrative level that had been needed for a long time. That's something, she said. It's more than something, he said. She went back to work the next day. Bed 4 had a new patient, a 63-year-old man with a post-surgical infection, and she read his chart carefully, and she listened to his lungs, and she adjusted his antibiotics, and she did the job the way she had always done it. Completely carefully, without cutting corners, without letting her own pain make her less present for someone else's. Her knee hurt the way it always did. She was used to that. What she was not used to, what she was still learning, was this: the feeling of having been through something that had tried to diminish her, and having not been diminished. She had not become smaller. She had not been silenced. She had sat in a locked room at 3 a.m. with her hands flat on a cold table, and she had breathed and waited and done what needed to be done. And the system had not devoured her, and she was still here. Still in scrubs, still on her feet, still doing the work. She pulled a chair to her patient's bedside, and she asked him how he was feeling. And he said he'd had a rough night, and she said, "I know what that's like," and she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with infection or surgery or the particular chemistry of post-op care. And when the shift was over and she walked out to the parking garage, her car retrieved, her record clear, her name intact, she stopped for just a moment in the cold air and looked up. The sky was the same dark it always was at the end of a long night. She walked to her car. She drove home. She had done harder things than this.